Good morning, welcome to Indycar with Gordon Ross. Today I'm in Partick, and today's two subjects, in fact three subjects, are in direct response to emails and messages from individual viewers who have suggested that I look at the different issues they brought up on the show. So in response to these messages that I've had, I wanted to cover three items today. The first one, and this is, I think, rather a sensitive issue, so I'm going to try and handle it as sensitively as I can, is the issue of English migrants coming to Scotland to escape from the ravages of Tory austerity, to find work in our NHS because our NHS is properly funded, and to settle in Scotland and to adopt the slightly slower pace of life up here with our lower property prices and our great scenery and all of the outdoor activities that we can offer. So all of these English people who come to settle here, of course, are most welcome. But there is an issue that somebody has raised, which is that many English migrants who've come to Scotland either as almost like refugees from a very austere part of the United Kingdom in Northern England, North East England, where there are very few jobs and opportunities. When they come here, sometimes they cling on to the idea of the UK as a union and to the benefits that they perceive from that, the idea of tying all the nations together and everybody acting as one. It all sounds wonderful. But the problem is that if in another referendum or an election, whichever we choose to have, in order to decide whether we accept and stay in the union, if these voters were to vote no because of old allegiances, shall we say, old habits, because they still believe the union to be valuable, which is a reasonable position to take if you come from England, you probably see it that way. But if they do that, the problem is, and I'm addressing this comment directly to you if you're an English person who's settled in Scotland, is that if you vote no, what happens is you're effectively voting for the Conservative Party to come all the way up to Scotland and to undo all of devolution and bring Tory direct rule straight to Scotland. Because if anybody who has migrated here works against the country in that way by voting no, what will happen is they're inadvertently, accidentally, without meaning to do this, I'm sure, will cause us to lose the referendum. And by losing the referendum, what will happen is, what the Tories are already preparing, is that the Conservative Party under David Mundell, Ruth Davidson and whoever else will take over the running of Scotland from a separate office in Edinburgh on behalf of the Tories, and we will have Tory rule in Scotland forevermore. Now, this is precisely the kind of thing that most of these people migrating from England, the north of England particularly, into Scotland are trying to escape from. Now, I know that a large percentage of you, if you've come from England, might be Conservative Party voters. But the problem is you've moved to a country where Conservative Party voters are in a tiny, tiny minority. And in Scotland, the Conservative Party is the Unionist Party, but it's the only real Unionist party which has the word Unionist in its title. Even the Labour Party in Scotland does not have Labour and Unionist on its epithet. It doesn't say that it's a Unionist party. Although there are arguments that say Labour is a Unionist party, and to a large extent it has been. But many Labour voters from England will have come to Scotland to settle, and they have the left of centre values that fit well with Scottish society, but they might also bring this hangover of Britishness with them, and this clinging to the Union as something valuable, some kind of valuable possession which cannot be messed with. But the problem is, as I say, if they vote no in the next referendum, people who are well-meaning, traditional left-wing voters from England who've moved up here in good faith and been accepted in good faith will inadvertently cause permanent Tory overlordship of Scotland. And I'm sure nobody would want to do that. So my comments today are addressed to you. You're welcome here as Scots, and we value everybody who comes here from any country. It doesn't matter whether it's England, Wales, Northern Ireland, further afield, it doesn't matter. But the point is that we need your help. We're not fighting against England, we're fighting against Tory direct rule from London, and we're fighting to save our own Parliament. And remember that Scotland is not a region of the UK. Scotland is a country, it's a nation, it's separate, it's not England, and it is not Britain. And I think when you get the hang of this, when you move here, you realise that you're living in a separate country. And it is a separate country which has a constitution which dates back to 1320. Now, that brings me neatly on to the next question, which was, somebody asked me if the Acts and Treaties of Union are still on the UK statute book. Now, think about this for one moment. If the Acts and Treaties of Union were not on the UK statute book, we couldn't be in the Union at all, because the law which binds it together wouldn't exist. So we must still have the Acts and Treaties of Union on the UK statute books. So that's the first thing. There has to be an act, and there must be treaties to bind the act together. In other words, the treaties are between nations, the Acts of Union are Acts of Parliament, which enact those treaties once the political union is formed. But despite the fact that the Act of Union mentions a permanent union of the nations, it does not mean that it has to remain permanent forever. Because if you look at permanence and you look at unions in other places, for example, the Soviet Union, the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, one of the most powerful unions on the continent, and it fell apart, didn't it? And all of the countries which were absorbed into that got their independence back, and all became, and are now entering into the European Union, all became members of the EU. And so there is nothing in the laws of international politics or the constitutional laws which says that the Treaty of Union of the UK is some kind of special thing that cannot be broken. Of course it can be broken. If enough people in Scotland decide that they no longer feel the treaty is being honoured, then they can vote to have that treaty annulled. They can vote to have the Acts of Union in Scotland annulled and repealed. Remember, Scotland isn't extinguished as a place. When the two parliaments were unified, the Scottish Parliament still exists as a part of the British Parliament. So the MPs that we have down there are, or were, until about the 1990s, 1999, were the only Parliament of Scotland. But now we have a Parliament in Holyrood. So what has happened is, despite the fact that we're still in the Union with the UK, Scotland's government, Scotland's Parliament has separated itself again. In 1999, when the Parliament was formed and when the Scotland Act was written, it gave Scotland permanent powers. And it's these powers that were guaranteed under the EU laws and under the EU's court. The British government is using its withdrawal from the European Union as an excuse to remove Holyrood, effectively, to neuter it completely, because the legal underpinnings of it in the European Union will be gone. And they think that nobody will notice when they come back and snatch the powers away from Holyrood. Unfortunately, they're mistaken. Right? Everybody's going to notice. But the point I'm trying to make is that, yes, the Acts of Union can be repealed. It's a question of how we do it. Remember that we are a functioning Western democracy. We've accepted democracy for over 100 years here. And that means that whatever decisions we take as a nation, they have to be democratic. And that means we have to vote. It's just a question of how we vote on this subject. Now, we all know what the arguments are for and against independence at the moment, and the whole of the political furniture has been moved around because of Brexit. It now has changed so much that the situation we had prior to 2014 no longer exists. There is no stable or stability in the British economy. It's now all up in the air. The English and Welsh people have voted to remove themselves from the European Union. Scottish people have voted to remain in the Union. Northern Ireland has voted to remain in the Union despite the DUP being elected to Parliament in Westminster. So we have a completely chaotic situation. However, I'm digressing. The point is that yes, we could get the Acts repealed. We just simply have to have a legal ballot. Does it have to be a referendum? No. A referendum is just one method of doing this. The other method would be for the entire government to resign. I'm talking about the Scottish Government. For the entire Scottish Government to resign and maybe to withdraw their MPs from Westminster and call a snap Scottish general election on a single issue, and the single issue being independence or union. Simple as that. Now, if you divide the country into two, pro and against the union, you probably find that it will divide somewhere around about 62% for leaving the union, because what's happened and what's changed the balance of power in Scotland is that Brexit has upset it. And we cannot ignore Brexit. I'm not saying Brexit is the reason that we have to give for independence, but it's the catalyst that has changed the situation. It's the thing which has altered the situation that we're in. And we now face the possibility of hyper austerity, of extreme poverty, of massive job losses, of huge cuts in our exports, massive tariffs on imports, fast rising food prices, car manufacturers abandoning England for Europe because the inward investment is no longer worth it. We face power grab by Westminster government, trying to rein in all parts of the United Kingdom and to prevent any form of independence taking place in any one of them. So the power grab will be absolute and it will be ruthless and complete. So when we do vote, if it's a referendum, well, fine, but referendum has become a toxic issue. The Tories have made sure that the mere mention of the word referendum gets people annoyed, and that was their purpose in mentioning the word referendum hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times during the previous parliamentary elections. That was Ruth Davidson's entire strategy. It was to make people sick of the whole idea of independence. The word independence, the word referendum, she overused them so much that they became toxic. Now that works for a while in the PR spin world, but Scottish Government is cleverer than that, and I believe the Scottish independence movement is far smarter than that. If we do have a snap general election on a single issue of independence, that would mean the Scottish Government, the SNP, the Greens, and what I call GRIP, the grassroots independence people, will all stand behind it on one side. That will just leave mostly the Tories on the other. There will be some Labour voters who will still vote no. There might be still some Liberal Democrats who might still vote no. But a large number of Labour voters have already switched to yes because they've seen the writing on the wall. I would say, and I don't know what the Scottish Government's plans are, what the SNP plans to do, but I would say, first of all, they need to make sure that when they announce a vote, whichever type it is, that they have, first of all, established that there's a new currency. It's going to be the Scottish pound. So the pound in your pocket is going to be safe, that it is not going to be in a currency union with the Bank of England, and therefore a new bank, Central Bank of Scotland, will be set up with the 10% of the Bank of England that Scotland currently owns. Second thing is that pensions, we need to have a cast iron locked guarantee that all UK pensions, I'm talking about the state pension as well as private pension, but the state pension will be paid by the Scottish Government immediately upon independence. There will be no gaps in this, so that pensioners have a cast iron guarantee that there is no way on earth that their pensions will be at risk. This was a major scare tactic employed in the last referendum. That needs to be a guarantee, so we need to have that currency guarantee and the pension guarantee. And the third thing I think is, and it's important in a way because it was used against us, the Scottish Government must guarantee all of the shipyard workers at BAE Systems that they will place a massive order for surface vessels as soon as Scotland becomes independent, and that massive order, rolling order of vessels for the Scottish Navy will go on for the next 25 years, so that the people's jobs, the people who were told that their jobs would be going if they voted for independence, know that not only will their jobs be staying, they'll be staying for 25 years, guaranteed work, and that in those 25 years, the number of jobs in the shipyard will increase to cope with the workload that will be involved in buying all of this hardware for the new Scottish Navy. We don't want rusting old rust buckets from the old UK Navy. We don't want faulty ships with turbines that don't work in the warmer waters of the Mediterranean. And we don't want aircraft carriers that we cannot afford airplanes for. But the point is, we need to guarantee the things that lost us the last referendum have been addressed. And I am certain that the SNP is already doing this. The question now is, what kind of vote will we have? I quite like the idea myself of having a parliamentary vote, having a vote for a new Scottish government, because it will clearly polarise things into yes and no. If you want independence, you will vote for the Scottish National Party, or the Greens, or maybe for an independent candidate from GRIP. GRIP hasn't come up with any candidates yet for any kind of election, because no election has been called. But if it were, then GRIP could put up hundreds of candidates on the list. Now, the list was the way that the British government used to make sure that the SNP could not get a majority in Holyrood, by rigging the voting system so that there was always more members of, shall we say, unionist parties on the lists, and there were actually voted and first past the post, was supposed to prevent any kind of majority. So we need to use that system ourselves, and that means, I believe, that GRIP and the Greens should put up more candidates in the lists who are pro-independence, so that the SNP is not fighting alone on this, and that the system is not being used against the independence campaign as it has been in the past. We need to work with the system we've got, and that means putting up candidates from another party which is pro-independence. We must have at least 3 parties for independence to balance the 3 unionist parties that we have to fight. Otherwise, we haven't got a hope of winning. And this is, I believe, one of the ways that it could be done. The other option is to go for the famous referendum, the Indy Ref 2, which there is a good chance we will win. But again, there are provisos I would put on this. The first one is that the voting system needs to be changed. Now, if it's too early for a blockchain system to be used, okay, I would accept that we use some kind of modified version of the paper ballot system that we usually use. But we do not go down the road of issuing postal votes this time. Not at all. We must steer clear of them completely. They should be out of the door. The second thing is that all ballots should be counted, the ballot boxes should be emptied and opened in the polling stations and counted there, not transported hundreds of miles unseen by one individual. Goodness knows where they go, who they might be having a rendezvous with, what might happen to the votes inside that container. We don't want any possible vote tampering, and the best way to do that is to have the count in each polling station under the watchful gaze of observers from every interested party. That would be fair for everyone. The other thing I think is then, once the totals have been established at the polling stations, that those totals are agreed by all the observers, and they are then phoned through to the returning officer, who might be live in a television studio, where we can see those tallies being added in real time to the vote totalizer on the screen. This is probably the only transparent way that you could use the old paper voting system to achieve a similar kind of security to what we would get with blockchain. That's my opinion anyway. I don't know what you think of it, but that's what I believe. And so we come to a point now where all of these things can happen if they're done the right way. The problem is, in 2014 we did things wrong. We did a lot of things wrong. We made a lot of assumptions about the British state which were not accurate. We assumed they'd be reasonable, which they weren't. We assumed that they would act in their own self-interest, which they didn't. We assumed that they would play fair, which they definitely didn't do. We assumed that they would observe the purdah, which they didn't do. They broke that as well. And we assumed that they would not threaten Scotland with a trade embargo, which they did. They threatened not to buy our electricity, not to buy our ships. And these are the things which a British state we now know will do to hang on to Scotland. They'll lie, they'll cheat, they'll threaten, they'll withdraw their support, and they will threaten the trade embargo. But we mustn't be scared by that. It scared us the last time. We're not going to be scared this time. Anyway, that's all I have to say for today. These were all ideas to make you think a little bit, but I hope I've tried to answer the questions that people have put to me. I've also emailed Dr. Mark McNaught over at the University of Rennes. This is the man who's writing the new constitution for the Scottish Republic. And as a political scientist, he's the man for the job. But I've asked him to have a look at the issues of the acts and treaties of union, and to give us a kind of a legal opinion on where we stand with those, and how and what mechanism we can use to have those repealed. But the clock's ticking, as we all know, the clock is ticking, and eventually we're headed for a hard Brexit. I watched the news this morning. Boris Johnson is saying that there cannot be a customs arrangement because it would be like being in the EU, except that they're paying for it but they've no control over it. And in fact, many of the speakers this morning on BBC's Radio 4 were saying exactly the same thing. All these politicians were saying that they can't square the circle, they can't be in the EU, and you can't be outside the EU. They can't be outside the EU and still have the same deal. This having their cake and eating it, it's beginning now to dawn on the Tories that it can't work. It's beginning to dawn on everybody that it can't work. It's also beginning to dawn on them that there's going to have to be a hard border in Ireland, because despite what the DUP might be wishing, it is magical thinking to think that the European Union will have no border on its western boundary. It will have to have a boundary, and it will have to be some kind of checkpoint. Interestingly, there's a video doing the rounds at the moment, which you might have seen. It's an interview on Irish television concerning Scottish independence, and it's very interesting because one of the guests was pointing out that Scotland's economy is far larger than that of the Republic of Ireland, and the Republic of Ireland is quite capable of supporting itself, so there's absolutely no reason why Scotland could not do the same. And even with the alleged deficit that we are supposedly have incurred, which to me is actually just pretend, it's basically England's deficit, and they've given us an 8% share of their debt and called it Scottish deficit. But that aside, the Irish believe that Scotland can be independent quite easily, and in fact they seem to suggest that that's exactly what we should be doing, and I can't see any reason to argue with that. The Irish would love it if Scotland was independent, because if Scotland's independent, it can then have another referendum on how it trades with the EU, and I think we would probably vote to join the European Free Trade Association, which would allow us to trade over the border with Ireland without any kind of border controls, because we would have an agreement that allows us to do that without tariffs. We would have to pay for it, obviously. We wouldn't be members of the European Union, so it would satisfy some of the SNP members who don't want to be in the EU. So there's a lot of things going on at the moment, and it's all getting more and more positive. I've just tried to outline what I think we have to do, and what I hope the SNP government is doing in the background while we speak, actually, because in June I expect the SNP to make a big announcement of some kind. I don't know what they're going to do, but I hope to hell that they're going to announce a date for some kind of vote, whether it is a snap general election in Scotland or whether it is a referendum or some other form of democratic decision making. I don't really care which, but I think it's high time that we did it. We all know that come March next year, all bets are off, and we will be dropping out of the EU, and all of the safeguards which are holding Scotland at the moment safe from the ravages of Tory austerity will disappear. The Tories will move in, seize control of Holyrood, and the game will be up for independence. It's high time we made a decision. I expect the SNP to come up with a cracking idea. I think they've got it. I think they've got it prepared. We're just waiting to see what it is. We have to trust them. We don't have anybody else in the political sphere who can do this for us. And despite my criticisms of the SNP, I do trust them to get this right. I don't know exactly what they're planning, but I'm pretty certain it's going to be the best possible method of doing this. So we'll wait and see. Anyway, I have to go, but as usual, contact me by email, by Facebook Messenger, or even just leave a comment on the thread of this show, and I'll speak to you later. Thanks. Bye for now.